Welcome to Real Solutions, a podcast series on policies for a future where everyone belongs. The Othering and Belonging Institute is hosting this podcast series with leaders from across the country to uplift and insist on bold policy solutions that would move the country towards belonging and well-being for all people.
What if no one in the US had to worry about finding an affordable place to live, getting evicted because they couldn't afford an increase in rent, becoming homeless? If everyone had access to living in a strong community? That's what we're talking about today. How do we get there to a vision like that?
And we argue that social housing is a real solution to the housing crisis in that it embraces but goes beyond simply building more housing units and demands those units be permanently affordable, promote social and racial equity, and include residents in decision making that affects their homes. It's a concept that can take many forms when it comes to implementation, but overall, it involves reimagining the government's role in and commitment to creating permanently affordable homes for all those who need them.
We have two guests who have been deeply involved in social housing today. Fernando Abarca is Associate Director of Capital Strategies at the Right to the City Alliance. He's a Salvadoran-American housing justice organizer based in Los Angeles, Tongva Lands in California.
And we're also joined by Roberto Jimenez, who is the Executive Director of Seattle's groundbreaking social housing program. He has more than 20 years of experience in planning and developing social housing, affordable housing for farm workers, and other types of housing. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back again to another episode of Real Solutions Podcast, the podcast where we talk about policy solutions for a world where everyone can thrive and belong. My name is Jose Richard Aviles, and I'm one of your co-hosts. And today we have a really fun topic, and we'll do a little deep dive. Eli, how are you doing?
Doing great. I'm excited for this. Hey, Richard, Fernando, Roberto. Excited to talk about social housing. Definitely have felt the pressures of the housing crisis personally and my loved ones, seeing them get displaced from their communities. So very interested in real solutions. What is social housing and how does it work? Roberto, can you kick us off?
So social housing is permanently affordable housing and affordable in perpetuity, right? So there's no end date. The families can stay there as long as they want and need to, and their incomes are only considered at the point of entry. They're not reconsidered annually as affordable housing is doing. It also, in our case, we're very much focused on sustainable development and community building. And so I'd say in social housing broadly in the world, there's a technical side and there is the human side. And our goal is to develop community, and by building housing and through real estate, that's how our approach is to building community.
Thanks. Fer, how do you define social housing?
Ditto to everything that Roberto said. The only thing that I think that I would add there in terms of like how we define social housing at Right to the City is, a key component of it is community stewardship, right? Like community control is a massive part of the social housing umbrella, which incorporates a whole bunch of different types of like non-market housing strategies for housing development or even preservation, right? For us primarily, and the folks that we support, we look at community land trust structures, cooperative structures, right? These types of structures have a community control element in which people basically have ownership and a level of autonomy over their housing as well. So that's a key component. And the other thing too, I think, is that it's made accessible to people who, in the current market, in terms of like these housing prices, would probably not be able to access and have ownership into housing in any other way. So accessible, stable, long-term, permanent, affordable is the way that we define it here at Right to the City.
How do you think social housing makes people's lives better? What does it do to some extent for communities?
I think that the easiest way, or like the most simple way that like I think about like what social housing makes possible in people's lives is like having a stable home can open up so many opportunities, right? Like I think that like the ability to be able to imagine or pursue a passion or an interest, right? When you don't have to be so concentrated on like your housing costs. I mean, I think about, how many people would potentially like just venture off and do their own thing, spin off, organizations, or just pursue even like artistic passions, right? Because like, that like your 50% of your income, 60% of your income, isn't going to housing, right? That you have a little bit more flexibility in your pocket. I think about, you know, parents, especially like universities right now are super expensive, right? Like people having to make decisions around like, what school their child is going to go to, after they graduate from high school, whether or not they can afford it or not, right? Like, and can they support their children's, through school or not? I think that like those things are made a little bit more possible, right? Like to be able to pursue different passions, to be able to support the next generation that is coming, under us, to be able to support our seniors, right? I mean, as things are getting cut, right? Like it just allows for like the opportunities to like go beyond, and support, I think our families, right? But I think also communities, right? I think it's like involvement. Um, and again, right, it stabilizes the whole market, right? I think that that's the other thing about social housing, that like beyond like the individual component of it, right? It's the potential stabilization of a family, but it's the stabilization of a community, when you're able to like just level off a market, because it's not subject to a market that's just predicated on making profit over profit over profit, right?
Let's talk about some of the examples. So you'll pointed out that one of the principles of social housing is that the residents who live in it have control over it. And so it's this kind of bottom-up approach that is emerging in a bunch of different communities around the country. Can you talk a little bit about what that's looking like in different cities and where it's happening?
So there are a lot of what's happening around the country should more appropriately be called mixed middle income housing. They're really using the technical tools of social housing to deliver housing. But they're not utilizing the other tools as much, or in most cases, that Farah was talking about. We are in Seattle, and I know that in Chicago, they want to do that. In our case, we were leading with those values around community engagement, around tenant, I wouldn't say control, but inclusion in the process. 60% of our board is residents, and that they're currently their renters appointed through the Renters Commission. And so it's about voice and creating a place where people feel engaged, a place where people feel a sense of ownership. One of the things we're seeing, and so much of, is what we call the churn, and people are moving into market rate buildings and moving out a year or 2 years later. So you never get to know your neighbors. There's no sense of community. And this is one of the things we're really trying to address, that facilitates life in the housing community, but also in the surrounding community, and gives people a sense of belonging, and also can really be impactful on people's mental health.
Here in LA in 2022, organizers and community folks were able to like advocate and pass, essentially what we call the mansion tax, the mansion ULA tax, right? United to House LA. This was passed back in November 2022, and the purpose of it was to create a revenue generating stream, right, that would support alternative forms of affordable housing, right? Both preservation, and new development. And since 2022, ULA has been able to raise about $784 million. About 80% of the current monies in Los Angeles for, just development of affordable housing in general, 80% of it is coming through the mansion tax, the ULA tax, which is massive. That's more than like, Los Angeles is getting in federal money, state money, in an equitable way to like, move resources from folks who have more to support folks who, again, have less, right? And being able to like access and house. I feel like most, a lot of our folks, unfortunately, in the current economy, are probably one paycheck away from housing insecurity rather than being one paycheck away from like owning their own home, right? And I think these types of measures really support, again, creative ways of thinking of housing that isn't just like a build strategy, right? It's not just about building, because also when we build new housing, there's still like a level of risk of displacement, right? I think that like having resourcing streams that support preservation projects, that help mitigate, any type of potential of folks having to be displaced, temporarily removed, because even when you temporarily remove people, it's hard for people to come back, right? Like that focus on making sure that people are able to be kept in place, I think is super critical. I mean, I think a lot of our communities here in Los Angeles have probably like changed over the years. As housing costs have gone up. People have had to move further out of the city, and still have to commute in the city. But to Roberto's point, you lose a huge sense of community in those scenarios, right? Like folks, you spend most of your time in a car rather than like, engaging with your neighbors, because you leave early in the morning, you come late at night. I also think about, the number of people who probably live in apartment complexes where they don't have to talk to their neighbors, so they never really meet their neighbors, right? I think that the other component of like the beautiful thing of social housing, and what these opportunities allow for folks, is that sense of, you have to get to know your neighbor, right? Like we have to make decisions, or we want to, for examples where like folks, community land trust cooperatives, where like folks buy into that model, right? Like it entices, it incentivizes you to get to know your neighbor, and the other folks that you live with. Just as a brief story in terms of like what it could look like, I just came back from Minneapolis yesterday afternoon, and I got the chance to visit the Sky Without Limits cooperative in Minneapolis. And they were able to transfer over 49 units of housing, from their landlord, transition it over to ownership to the residents of these buildings. That's 49 units. That's 49 families. So, things are happening in Minneapolis. Obviously, things are happening in LA. We have stuff going on in Santa Fe, New Mexico. There's different types of revenue policies being passed. But I think that the most important thing is just like how, like on a day-to-day basis, like people relate and are able to see one another.
One of the things that I hope comes true in all of social housing in this country is that those who are living in that housing are able, as they are in Vienna or Singapore, to pass that housing on to their children or their grandchildren. And so you create this long-lasting sense of community where people have a connection to both place and their neighbors.
100%. I appreciate what you both shared. This is the first time, full disclosure, that I've lived in an apartment building for the first time. And I think, I'm grateful for the fact that I appreciate being raised by chismosas, because I'm a chismosa. I'm like, I need to know who lives in this building. I don't think I necessarily feel like a resident yet. You know what I mean? Like I'm talking as a perspective of a chismosa, and it's maybe because of my own renter mentality. So it's interesting to think about even like the behavior and comportamiento, right? Like knowing that I'm a renter, it's like, well, let me just be this chismosa to see what these owners are talking about, because I'm technically not an owner. But it's fascinating to be on this end and to oh yes, I see what you're saying. But it's okay to be a chismosa wherever you live. You need to know who's around you. When we're talking about social housing, what exactly are the problems that we're trying to address, and particularly in this economy and in this political landscape that we're in 2025? Because there's always been an urgency for social housing, right? We've known that for the last couple of decades, but there's something about this moment in time particularly that adds another layer of urgency. I'm curious to hear from both of you. What does that urgency feel like?
For Seattle social housing, again, it's trying to keep people housed and helping actually address the people that are unsheltered, who may be living on the streets and bouncing from place to place, through eliminating the pressure on the affordable housing developers. There's a real sense of urgency there. When I was working in Sacramento over the last 8 years, we were building housing at such a pace that if the number of homeless had stayed what it was when we started, 7, 8 years later, we would have made a significant dent. But the number of people falling into homelessness increased. And so it just kept moving like that, upward. So while we're not directly providing permanent supportive housing or housing that is used to address those who are homeless and chronically homeless, their needs, we are a part of that system.
I think Roberto said it really well. I mean, we're trying to protect tenants, right, and prevent homelessness. Is the main bottom line. It's also a matter of safety, right? Like, where is it that we would feel most safe if anything was going down out on these streets? It's at home, right? Where is it that you feel most protected, and where you feel like a level of reassurance? It's probably at home. And that is only made even stronger when you live in a place that feels communal, where you also feel that your neighbors have your back, mainly because your neighbors from like, even just on the basic level, just even knowing, you have people checking up on you, right? Like, I think that the example that comes to mind, I have a friend of mine who lives in a building, and their neighbor was an elderly neighbor who also happens to be undocumented. And and here in Los Angeles, when the raids picked up earlier this year, like, one of the ways that my friend was able to show up for the senior, right, was going and picking up groceries for them, right, and bringing those groceries back, right. Like, she didn't have to go out of her house and go and take that risk, on her own, right? And she had someone who was able to, like, check up on her, right? Um, I think that those are like small little examples. If we had more types of housing where, like, folks were able to come together um, on a more consistent basis, like, it creates that level of, like, neighborly camaraderie, right? And it becomes more and more important, especially in this time where, like, a lot of our neighbors are under attack. Like, that just, it's like tenfold more important now than ever before.
I would also add that if we want to build community, we have to build buildings and neighborhoods in a way that facilitate that. And when I was developing housing for farm workers in Oregon, that was a really nice property that we were managing, and we had our offices on that site. But the building was designed in a very suburban style, which was maximizing privacy. And we were working with a population of folks who were feeling isolated because many of them didn't speak Spanish, most of them didn't speak English, and they had walked away from their own communities in Mexico and Central America, and they weren't able to find ways to connect. And so when we rehabbed that property, we redesigned the flow of the property to increase the opportunities for people to pass their neighbors and smile and make eye contact. And that really helped people feel like they were in a community where they were seen. And we saw an improvement in mental health, and especially the happiness of the children living in the community after that. We also redesigned the laundry rooms, and we put playgrounds out front and benches where the mothers could sit and they could take turns doing the laundry while the others watched the kids. And so they built their own communities that way.
Who are the people we're talking about that are really hit hardest by the current housing system, and how does that harm ripple out?
I mean, the cost of housing is it's astounding, and at the pace at which the cost has been increasing in recent years is frightening. And when you compound that with, say, the ICE raids that Farah was mentioning, people are really frightened, and we have communities of people just living in terror, and that's not good for them, certainly, but it's not good for the rest of our community either. And we're now seeing people at, say, 60% AMI, which is probably $70,000 a year in Seattle, who are having some of the same mental health problems that we see in chronically homeless folks. And so this is a situation that we've created by profiteering in market rate housing and not being able to provide enough housing for broadly people who can afford it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of touched upon it in different ways, right? But like our more marginalized folks, right, in our communities, right, whether you're like undocumented, whether you're kids, like again, like seniors these days, I actually continuously think as my parents age, I think about like, they have 3 kids, like, we all kind of take turns in different ways supporting our folks. Some folks don't have that, right, as they age, right, um and I mean, it's shocking sometimes to think about people having to depend on SSI to survive. I think about folks who unfortunately feel like they have to live in the shadows and have to like shrink themselves, um, because of like, any type of potential fear, right? And don't feel like they can voice any concern, um, out of any type of potential, retribution against them, just for speaking up and trying to make a repair within like their unit, and live in really, um, again, really dilapidated conditions in their housing, right? I think, those folks, unfortunately, those are some of the stories that we don't hear about housing sometimes. Those folks that like live in those types of housing that are scared, to voice concerns about the conditions in which they live. Those are the folks that I think social housing is more geared towards trying to support. That 0 to 30% area median income, which, traditional affordable housing strategies don't, unfortunately, they don't go that low. And those are the folks that are more, at risk of being, housing insecure. Those populations of folks is who we absolutely need to be supporting in this moment in time.
I think, I would be a little remiss as well. We're talking, as a queer person, not to include queer folks in the conversation. Also, like, we're recording this episode for listeners who are listening on October 31st. Yes, Halloween, but also the end of the month. So think about the conversations that are happening right now in this moment as this podcast is being recorded, when folks are trying to figure out how to pay tomorrow. You know what I mean? And I think one of the things that I've known, this is true for my family, like, we've become sort of not only an intergenerational family, but a mixed income family. Like, the income disparities across my families are very, very different. And so it's interesting that we become, and funny as a queer person myself, become like this sort of, I don't know. It feels like now a lot of like we talked about this in maybe in another episode as well. But the tandas and the cundinas and sort of like the community banking systems that have to be created in order to be able to like, okay, are we all good? And it's so funny because I think, to your point, Roberto, community has been created, but out of a sense of necessity and out of a sense of resourceness, as opposed to a sense of community being created out of belonging. You know what I mean? And even thinking about the nuclear family to some extent, or the extended family as a source of income. Imagine like the queer folks and queer seniors who don't have that. And are not included in the conversation so much in social housing and how to mitigate that. But I'm curious to think about you, or to ask you, what is it about current structures that is making it impossible to arrive to a solution?
Habit, systems, for nonprofit affordable developers who are under so much pressure to do what they're doing that they don't have the bandwidth to think about how to do it differently. And it's not an accident that we haven't had social housing in this country. We had something like social housing in this country 100 years ago. But the public housing was not initially limited to the AMI levels that it currently is. That was a change pushed by the realtors in Congress. And so policy was changed. And that limited the number of people who could be in the housing. It used to be a much broader range of people who could live there. And that's what's important. Having that broader range allows you to have a range of rental limits. And so you have higher revenue on the building, which allows you to take care of the building in a better way, which allows you to employ staff who have the right skills to both do the compliance, because it's heavily regulated on their side, on the affordable side, and it's complex and takes a lot of training to be able to do, but also have the customer service skills to interact with people who live in the housing, right? I don't separate the people who manage affordable housing from the people who live there. In my experience, in my model, they are essentially the same people. They come from the same place, right? And that's really important to so that people feel seen and heard and understood. The financing structures were different prior to Ronald Reagan becoming president. And Ronald Reagan gutted the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and took away the direct financing for housing and came up with this system of tax credits, which has been a very powerful tool and has delivered most of the affordable housing that exists in the country. But it has very clear limitations. It is heavily regulated. It actually was designed to provide a benefit to investors in the tax credit, right? It wasn't just to provide a financing tool to build more housing for people, right? So it was really twofold, and these are contrary goals.
My family lost their home during the foreclosure crisis, and I kind of sometimes imagine someone like looking at a spreadsheet or looking at our contract and like being like, yeah, no, like they can't make the mortgage. Like, I'm sorry, you have to figure out another place to live. And I'm like how cold is that, and to feel okay in making a decision, in terms of like displacing a family from their home. We prioritize profit over people when I think we need to be prioritizing community over commodities, right? Like, I think that is the shift, and that I think social housing is allowing a pathway for us to be able to envision, because it's hard to envision something different than what we currently have, right? Because this, to Roberto's point around like the policies from the 70s and HUD in the 40s and all these, programs over the, at this point, probably like almost 100 years of doing it this way. It's hard to imagine an alternative. But, again, to Roberto's point, we're way past due, a shift. Housing prices continue to go up and our people's salaries do not, right? We have more and more families, living in like a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, like multiple families living in an apartment, like, unit, because they need to do so in order to like just be able to like remain and stay in their communities. And not, they would have to like travel, to not even like a half hour. I'm not talking about a half-hour trek. I think there's people who like come to work in LA who live in like Bakersfield, or who live in Fresno, or like definitely who live in San Bernardino. That trek from San Bernardino down to like downtown LA with LA traffic, which again, part of the traffic problem is, folks having to move away. That is probably like a 4-hour-a-day drive, that people are having. How destabilizing is that for a home when you have your kids back home and you don't get to see them because you leave really early, you come really late at night? The impacts that like just not having housing stability has, beyond just being worried about making rent, it's just like there's a time component too. You do not spend time in your community. You don't spend time with your family. You don't spend time with your kids.
One of the things that really shocked me when I started to learn more about affordable housing and how it's designed these days was that the requirement that a home stay affordable expires. And so you have this like public investment and all this planning that goes into making a home affordable. And then it expires and becomes like drifts out of that affordable pool of homes and is lost. And then also the people who are living in affordable housing can get kicked out when they actually start to get ahead and maybe get a better job or get a little bit more income and start to be able to save. And so it just seems like the whole thing is set up to be temporary. And so then when we expect that to be a kind of shortcoming and a false solution if it's set up to be temporary by design. But can you talk a little bit about like why you think that is, or what are some of the other assumptions and values behind the system as we have it?
Many of the programs, the financing programs at various levels, starting at the federal highest level, did not consider nonprofits being developers. They were designed to bring market rate developers into development of housing. And so to incentivize that, the profits have to be, there have to be significant profits available. Over time, those profits have become larger and larger. And so there are very few actually nonprofit affordable developers working nationally. When you think about all of the housing being built in the country, most of it is developed by market rate developers, and increasingly, or almost totally at this point, through investment pools, right? And so it's all about profit. If people weren't spending so much money on gas and cars to get to work, they would be spending that money in their own communities and on their families and their own lives. And it's not a zero-sum game, right? If we can create more affordability in urban areas, then people don't have the high need for cars. The environment is improved, right? But the money still gets spent in positive ways. And so I think there are positive impacts from social housing if we can build housing closer to where people work. And the economic impacts will be there too, because we know this through data, people will be missing fewer days of work, right? If they are near where their children are, then they don't have to miss a whole day of work to take care of their children. That's not possible for so many people. And if the parent thinks their child is getting sick, well, then they may have to miss a whole day of work. Then the income is lost. The stress level of the loss of income and not being able to take care of your children's needs, potentially not being able to take care of your children's needs, is really a painful choice that people have to make in a lot of cases.
Roberto, I'm going to borrow one of your lines actually from earlier on this call about, like the ability to be able to like transfer ownership, right, to like your next generation, right? And I think that that's part of like the flaw of like, currently like affordable housing being temporary, right? And understanding that the idea is for us to be able to like, we want to be able to grow out, for folks to be able to have autonomy to choose whether or not they want to like go and buy a home and be a homeowner, right? Or whether they want to go out and move, or right, to live in a different part of a city or a state, right? But I think people should have also the right and the autonomy to choose if they want to like stay, right? And if so, right, like I'm thinking about also like a little bit about my trajectory. Like I love LA, like and I moved around a bunch. And I always say that LA is that place that I need to like leave every couple of years because it stresses me out, and I love it here and this is home. But every once in a while I gotta leave for a little bit, and I have to come, but then I'm like, oh, I miss home and I want to come back, and I've always wished that I could come back to like the communities. There's specific communities that I think about that I would want to come back to that I cannot come back to because I cannot afford to like live there and have a stake there currently under the current market, let alone people who are are low income and under resourced and would want to like move around the city or even have a stake in their community, but they can't. And one of these actually trips that I took away from the city, I actually lived in El Salvador for a little bit and lived in a community land trust, in a rural village, and it was beautiful, and it's hard living, but folks coming together communally, having communal conversations to make decisions together was a beautiful thing. But I think like, and I've never forgotten, I think that the most important lesson, and I've said this to multiple people over the years since I've come back, that I took away from that experience was what they call relevo generacional, generational relief, right? It's like we want to support the next generation, right? Because we are aging out of like this important community work, and we're trying to bring in a younger generation to have like the same values, right, and level of respect for like the community project that we're trying to put together here. And that is only made possible because folks don't have to worry about like having to like leave their community, because they're able to stay because they have a stake in that community. And housing insecurity there does not exist, right? What would it mean for us to be able to have the autonomy that if I want to go, that is a wonderful thing. But if I want to stay and provide generational relief, right, for my kids to come up here and take over this community project, right, and planning our neighborhoods and, to Roberto's point, is spending time and investing, right, in like, the little market down the street where la señora selling tortillas, right, like, or there's, you're going down the street and you're buying soul food from the local soul food spot, right, like a lot of folks down in Inglewood, right. Like people should have the autonomy to be able to do that too.
As we've been having these conversations on the podcast, it's cool to see how, in addition to proposing a policy solution, what we're also asking for, and I think what you both have done really well, and thank you for that, is the paradigm shift that is needed, right? Because it's not just about a policy that sort of makes some things into a reality and we can, have some accountability behind it, but it's also this paradigm shift. So I'm curious to ask you both, what is it about social housing, or what is the type of value that we're trying to think we're trying to instill also in community when we're thinking about social housing?
I think this connects in my mind with Eli's prior question, and about temporary solutions. I think rental housing, people in this country have been taught that rental housing is temporary, right? It's only where you are because you haven't got to the place where you can own your own home. And owning your own home is not right for everybody. And people should have options. And if they weren't spending so much money on their market rate rental housing, then they could save money to buy a home, or they could save money to send their kids to school, or they could just have enough money to pay for their car repairs, right? And I think that it's all been perceived as really temporary, and increasingly it has become that for far too many. And that just has way too many negative impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of like the paradigm shift is, I feel like we've gone to a place where we use housing, homes, as a way of accessing generational wealth, right? What is the quickest way in which we can like go from having very little to having a whole lot more? What if I buy one house and then I buy two houses, and then I rent that second house, and then with the income of that, what if I buy a third one, and then it's like the amount of like YouTube commercials that I've seen where like people are like, I can help you like in 90-minute class how to like purchase your first home, and then two, and then three, and it's just kind of like, first of all, like, that's inappropriate. Like we're talking about people's homes, like, it's just, but it's like, we don't, it's kind of, I don't, when I sit back and I actually think about like just like the jarring experience of what it must mean to like play around with like people's like livelihoods, but not think about people inside. You think about the structure, but not the people in the structure, and how like the thing that you're talking about like takes autonomy from the people in that home. Like it's kind of wild, and I think that like we've kind of gone to this place where like we don't think about the people in the home, we just think about the structure and how much profit we can make out of the structure, without thinking that like those people will no longer be able to like live there, right? And I think that that's part of the paradigm shift that we need to move back to, like, a home is a place of safety, stability, community growth and investment. Just one notch adjacent to a commons, a common benefit that we should all have access to. Like housing should, um, uh, housing should be a human right. At the end of the day, like, that's really what it should come to, right? Like we should all have access to a decent home, regardless of socioeconomic status and or otherwise, right? Like we shouldn't be seeing people having to starve to death on the street, right? Especially in a country with so much wealth. We should all just have a place to be able to call home.
I'll tell you one thing, it's common sense to a lot of the children I know. They see people living on the street and they're like, why don't they have a home? Like just point blank, because they haven't been socialized into thinking like, oh, this is normal. This is okay. There's nothing to be done, the way a lot of us adults have. And I think we need to kind of unlearn some of that. And I think that's part of what's exciting about social housing, is because it's this paradigm shift, and it really kind of gives hope towards a solution that would actually rise to the challenge of housing for all people. But we wanted to also get into kind of what are some of the complementary policies that would really allow social housing to reach its full potential. How do you see that? What does it kind of need to be coupled with as a system intervention?
Yeah, part of what you're saying there is that we've been socialized, right? And I think Farah was saying this as well. We've been socialized to the commodification of housing, right? And that may be the paradigm shift, or at least the alternative, an alternative to the commodification of housing. One of the first positions we're creating, so I'm the only staff person at Seattle Social Housing at this point in time, but the first person I'm hiring is a director of design and policy. So there, if we're going to put our money where our mouth is, we want to build buildings that belong to that community, that fit in that community, which create more of a sense of community for the people living in the buildings. So that's leading with design. The other side of it is that in order to do some of the design we want to do, there are public policies that need to shift. An example of that is single stair housing, which for good reasons years ago was mostly made outlawed, and it was for fire safety. But the fire safety has changed in decades. And so single stair housing makes a lot of sense. It reduces the cost of the building. It increases the potential for human interaction. It increases the ability to design buildings that are not necessarily what we call double loaded corridor, where it's just one long hallway with units looking directly into the units across from them. You have a single stairwell into the building, and they're not high rise, right? But they're just walk-ups, maybe 2 or 3 stories. Yeah, so if you have, historically, if you had single stair housing and there was a fire, like it created a real hazard. But we now have sprinkler systems and so many ways of mitigating fires in the way that buildings are designed. We should have the option to build single stair housing again. And so this position, that's the other side of it. That's what this person will be working on, improving public policies related to housing in the city of Seattle, so that they serve people better, right? And potentially reduce the cost of building that housing as well.
Tenant protections of all the sorts are critical, including legal, right? But the ones that come to mind, front and center for us, and a lot of Red to the City is a national alliance of 70 plus organizations. A lot of the policies that are member organizations are working on across the country are, tenant opportunity to purchase acts, right? Community opportunity to purchase, right? Like, folks being able to have first right of refusal when, their building is potentially going up for sale, and to be given enough time to then figure out if they can raise the resources before it's put onto the market for anyone else. I think is one example of a policy that can help mitigate, right, potential displacement, that goes along with then once that house is passed over to tenant ownership, it's it could be in theory be part of a social housing program or package, right? But we need to be able to acquire that property first, right? People need to be able to have the opportunity to be able to access the ability to buy the time to acquire the capital, to acquire the building is one, and with that, right? I would say as well as like policies for permanent revenue sources, right? Like, I think that's the other one, right? We talked about the mansion tax, United to House LA here in Los Angeles, right? And the pool of money that's generating, right? The idea or the hope that some of folks who are trying to figure out a way to transition their apartments to communal ownership, right? To be able to have a pool of money that then they can access at the city to significantly subsidize, right? The capital package needed to be able to close on the deal and acquire the building, I think is important. So tenant opportunity to purchase, to buy time, to be able to acquire revenue sources, at both at the local level, at the state level. But the other one too that we've been really drilling, and it's part of a national demand that we have here right to the city, is rent control, right? Being able to fight for rent control, to stabilize housing, to remove just the nature of like speculation is critical, right?
One of the policies that I just recalled that we're working on immediately too is tax exemption. So if we have automatic tax exemption, as housing authorities in Washington do, then we can start to land bank, right? The challenge for the nonprofit affordable developers is that they have to pay taxes on that land when they buy it, and they have to use commercial debt generally to acquire the property. So it's very expensive to land bank. But if we can land bank, imagine that, right? We have our own source of capital through our own revolving loan fund. So we're not using commercial debt, it's cheaper. And we have tax exemption, then we can start buying up land. And this is what Vienna, Austria did so well, is they just bought up more and more land and built more and more of their own model of housing. And today, 80% of all people in Vienna live in rental housing, and 60% of them live in social housing, right? And if developers want to get in the real estate development game, they pretty much have to work with the Vienna government that regulates the housing and the land. And so it has a real impact on the cost of land. And we're used to the commodification, and we're also used to the value going up and up and up. But when it stabilizes, that doesn't happen. It's not constantly going up and up and up, right? So there are upsides to that and downsides to that. But I would say there's much more upside in that there's less land for commercial developers to buy up and cut off from affordable housing development of any kind, right? So that could be very powerful.
Just a shout out to the listeners who are listening, because I know y'all are out there listening. Listen, if you are like myself right now that is mad, stay mad, strategize, and organize. Because listen, I was like, I'm mad at y'all for getting me mad on a Friday. But we need to be staying mad. With that being said, we've arrived to our last question of this episode. And so I'm wondering if you both, in 1 minute or less, what is one major takeaway that you would want our listeners to take away from this episode?
I think the main takeaway that I would want to leave people with is like, we need alternative solutions to stabilize our housing and protect our longstanding community residents at risk of being displaced, especially in rapidly gentrifying communities. Social housing can not only help us, it's not only about helping us build in the traditional way, but it can also help us imagine and reinvent just the way that we've done things in the past, and allow us new opportunities to steward and govern, and have autonomy over our communities and our homes, which is the most important thing, while mitigating the risk of displacement, which again is a huge component of why it is that we do this work and why we like venture into these alternatives in the first place.
Seattle Social Housing Developer, the agency, was brought forward by a citizen initiative and a vote of the people, right? We all created this problem, and we all can undo this problem. And it's not each individual, but we collectively. I want people to know that this can be done, right? That it was overwhelmingly supported by the voters of Seattle, and it can be done elsewhere.
Yeah, it's so inspiring to hear about what's going on in Seattle and Los Angeles, because it's so visionary, like we've been talking about. It's a whole different paradigm, but it's also so practical and real and tangible. And to see the actual buildings that are being built or acquired and people moving into them and the lives that that makes possible is just a great sign of hope to me. So thank you for all your work.
Yes, thank you again. And thank you again to all of our listeners who are listening. We've been getting your feedback and we are listening to you all. And so thank you all so much for listening. And again, that's another episode of the Real Solutions Podcast. Like I said earlier, stay mad, strategize, and organize.